So thank you very much for coming this morning to our breakfast meeting that we have on the Early Childhood Center. I just want to let everyone know that we are being broadcast, not live, but we're being taped by RCTV this morning so that we can hopefully get it to a greater audience on this information. This is the fourth of 5 presentations that we are doing informational opportunities on the Early Childhood Center. And my name is John Doherty, Superintendent of Schools, Mary Delay, Assistant Superintendent for Finance and Operations. We also have here members of the Early Childhood Working Group that did a tremendous amount of work over the last several months to narrow down the different options that were being looked at for the Early Childhood Center. So what we want to do today is we want to talk to you about the need for an Early Childhood Center and for full-day kindergarten, talk about the different pieces of data that we've discovered and come up with over the last several months. A review of the timeline up to this point. We've been talking about full-day kindergarten and early childhood since 2011, January of 2011, and the needs that surrounded that area. We're going to take a look at the options that the working group looked at to come to the conclusion of the location for the Early Childhood Center. A review of the option that the school committee voted on in early March. What will happen if we don't move forward, the next steps in the process, and certainly we'll take questions. What we've learned through these information sessions, it's best to hold your questions till the end, because a lot of times we are answering them throughout the presentation. So if you could just jot them down, and then we'll be more than happy to spend some time to answer those at the end of the presentation. So first we want to talk about the need and what are the reasons behind the Early Childhood Center. What we've seen, and I'm going to provide some data to back up these bullet points, but we've seen an increase in both the enrollment for full-day kindergarten and RISE over the last several years. We've also seen a need for space related to increased programmatic need for special education programs. There's also, as you can see in the graph that I'm going to show you, that not only has it been an increase in need for full-day kindergarten, but an increase in need to provide publicly funded full-day kindergarten. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how Massachusetts is one of the states that provides incentives for districts to go to full-day kindergarten through the Chapter 70 funding formula. And then all of this relates to the need for the additional elementary classroom space and special education instructional space that's tied into programmatic issues at this level, and also for additional high school classroom space because of both an increase in enrollment at the high school, but also because of an increase of programmatic needs at the high school. So first of all, some research behind full-day kindergarten. There's been a lot of research over the last several years that has been done in a variety of settings, both suburban, urban, rural communities, about the need for full-day kindergarten. And what they've done is they've taken a look at cross-sections of different studies, research studies, and what they've seen is that children that are in full-day kindergarten across the board have a higher academic average achievement in the later grades. They show greater reading and math literacy gains in the early years, particularly up to 3rd grade. There's clearly also an enhanced social and emotional behavior benefit to being in full-day kindergarten. And they're more prepared for school. We also see less retention with students that are in full-day kindergarten, less remediation, and less referrals for students for special education. So there is very positive benefits for providing full-day kindergarten for students at 5 years old. I'm going to now shift to Reading data on a few slides here to show you some of the needs. And what you have here is, as you know, the MCAS is the state assessment that's given over several years, beginning in grade 3, going all the way up to grade 8, and then a test in grade 10. And grade 3 being the first year, what the state does is not only do they provide what's called the aggregate score of all of the students, but they also can provide us scores based on what's called subgroups of different students to see are there different groups of students that have greater need than other students. There is a subgroup that the state has called a high-need subgroup. And the high-need subgroup consists of 3 different groups of students. One is students that are on individualized education plans, so special education students. Also, students that are English language learners, where English is not their first language. And the third group that's in this high-need subgroup are students that are on free and reduced lunch. So these are students that would receive additional services, Title I services, high poverty students. And what we're talking about in each of these 4 years of MCAS data is that this is for the ELA scores for students that are in this high need subgroup. We're talking about 65 to 75 students each year that would fit into this category. And what you see, the way MCAS works is that there are 4 levels of achievement: the advanced, which is blue, proficient light blue, needs improvement, which is the light red, and then the dark red, which is the warning and the failing. And what you see over these 4 years is that over 50% each year, well over 50% each year of these students are in the needs improvement or warning category for MCAS. Most of these students came in and did not participate in our full-day kindergarten program. They were half-day kindergarten students. This is at a time, 2010 to 2013 is when they were entering kindergarten between 2006 and 2010, when our percentage of students in full-day kindergarten were fairly low. We also see the same in math. Again, this is the high need subgroup for Reading students, and you can see again that academically these are students that would benefit the most from full-day kindergarten. Were not in full-day kindergarten, and you could see that academically are not as advanced as other students. We also know that in our community and in other communities across Massachusetts and in the country, that full-day kindergarten is preferred by teachers and it is preferred by parents. More and more we are seeing that. And one of the things that we're also finding out in Massachusetts is that they are one of 14 states that allow districts to charge tuition. And we have been charging tuition since 2005-06 when full-day kindergarten started in Reading. In Massachusetts alone, since 2000, the number of students in full-day kindergarten has gone up from 29% to 87% currently. And 242 communities currently offer publicly funded full-day kindergarten. Reading is not one of those communities because we charge tuition. And we actually have the 3rd highest tuition in the state at $4,200. This map shows you the number of communities that are that provide both publicly funded full-day kindergarten and tuition-based. The lightest color are all of the tuition-free full-day kindergarten communities. And then you see the other colors are varying degrees of communities based on the tuition that they charge. Reading is in this last orange category here, dark orange category. We're one of 21 communities that charge the tuition between $3,700 and $4,900. And then the communities in purple do not offer full-day kindergarten at all. So why are there so many communities in Massachusetts that offer it? Publicly funded full-day kindergarten. And the biggest reason is because Massachusetts has created an incentive through the Chapter 70 formula that if students are attending kindergarten, full-day kindergarten, without tuition, that they would be counted as full-time students in the Chapter 70 funding formula. In Reading right now, we don't have a lot of students that go tuition-free to kindergarten for full-day. Usually it's students that are on an IEP for special education services. We have a handful, maybe around 10 students. But the rest of the students that are paying tuition for full-day kindergarten, they are counted as half-day students. If we were to go to a publicly funded formula, for approximately a year where we have 320 students, which is about average number of students that we would have in kindergarten for Reading, we would see an increase in our Chapter 70 formula of approximately $1.1 million annually, depending on the number of students each year. That certainly would be able to go to fund any additional staffing that would be needed for full-day kindergarten, which would include an increase in kindergarten staff that we would need, paraeducators, for the full day piece, and other support staff to do that. 2 years ago, when we realized that we were having these space issues because of the programmatic needs at our elementary level, we started surveying our K-12, pre-K to 12 parent community. And we asked them several questions. One of the questions we asked, if we were able to provide publicly funded full-day kindergarten, if space was available, is this something that you would support? And 81% at the time, this is again 2012, but 81% of the time, and there was 689 people that responded to the survey, said that they would. We also asked several other questions surrounding space, because we knew that space was going to be the reason if we were not going to be able to move forward. So we asked a series of questions to parents that, you know, to look for a long-term solution, would you consider building an early childhood center a desirable solution? And we had different options. We had adding to current elementary schools, building an early childhood center, renting space, providing modular classrooms. Those are some of the options we gave. And building an early childhood center was most desirable by 63% of the respondents. 18% said maybe, 20% said it was the least desirable. This was the second highest rated response. The first highest rated response was to build at our current elementary schools, which we have learned since then that we cannot do. And I'll get into more detail on that a little bit later. Another piece of data that has caused this shift and this change in space and shift in program is our full-day kindergarten enrollment since 2005-06, when the 5th elementary school came online. And I should say that when we had 5 elementary schools come online in 2005-06, that the original design for those 5 elementary schools was 1 full-day kindergarten classroom for each of the schools. At the time, full-day kindergarten was not something that programmatically a lot of communities were using or looking into. And so the design at that time was to go with 1 classroom per each of the 5 elementary schools. So you can see in 2005-06 that our enrollment was 32%. 32% of the total population was attending full-day kindergarten, and this is all tuition-based. Since then, you can see there's been a steady increase in the number of students that have participated in full-day kindergarten, and next year we are at 221 students, which is 72% of our population for next year. So you can see that there has been a slow incremental increase, and you can see that this next chart shows you the graph of how that has steadily increased over time, the percent of students in full-day kindergarten. So there is definitely a need there, that this is something that parents prefer. Educationally, it makes sense with the increased curriculum demands that are now on kindergarten and even preschool students. The frameworks now includes up to all the way down to preschool. That this is something certainly that a full day of instruction would certainly benefit students more than a half day of instruction. We have also seen an increase in our RISE preschool population. I do want to just talk briefly about what RISE is. RISE is an integrated preschool program of both general education students and special education students. I think for many years there was a perception that RISE was just for special education students, and that's not been the case. You could see in 2005-06 that the breakdown was about 82 students, and that has slowly risen as well. But a couple of things that you should know that are tied into state regulations. First of all, in a preschool program or any general education setting, your special education students you need to have less special education students in a classroom than general education students. And the ratio by law has to be at a minimum 51% general education, 49% special education. Certainly you want as high a percentage as possible, because then both general education students to special education, because then both general education and special education students benefit from that inclusionary setting. So in a perfect scenario, you would want a very high percentage of general education students and a smaller percentage of special education students. And in fact, in one year, 2011-12, we actually weren't able to do that. We were out of compliance, that we had more special education than general education. So that's one piece. The other piece that you should know is that this number right now is low because with preschool, they can begin preschool when they turn and receive services once they turn 3 years old, which is different than kindergarten. Kindergarten, if you're 5 years old by August 31st, then you would enter. But with preschool, it's much different. So when you turn 3, if you qualify for services, then you could start no matter what time in the calendar it is. So this number in 2014-15, although it's only 26 right now, this number will continue to grow throughout the entire year. And usually, by the end of a year, we're hitting close to 120 students in the last couple of years. The other thing that you should note is that this number that you see here for 2014-15 for next year includes does not include another list of general education students, a waiting list of 25 students. And so there's a couple of reasons why that's a concern. So first of all, from an educational setting, we would certainly want, if we have students that want to enter our preschool program, we would want to welcome them because the earlier we can get them into our preschool to K program, the better for those students. But from a financial standpoint, because all of the general education students are tuition-based students, they pay a tuition to be in the program. Those are students that would not be paying tuition, those families. And so this is, if we had the space for these 25 students, it would be an additional $144,000 in revenue that we would be able to put back into the RISE preschool program. So a couple of things about RISE there that you should know. But you can see that we have had also an increase in that program as well. When we first started in 2005-06, I should also say we started with 5 classrooms in RISE. I'm sorry, we started with 4. About 2011-12, we added a 5th classroom, which we converted from a therapy space to make 5. And now we're up to 7 classrooms. We've used 2 classrooms. We use 2 classrooms that are at the Wood End Elementary School as satellite classrooms. So we're up to 7 RISE classrooms right now. We could probably go as high as 10. And you can see that this chart shows you the increase that we've seen in RISE, and really the only reason why it's leveled off is because the space has constrained us from allowing to add more space. You know, and I mentioned most of this already, but you know, it is really important to have that high ratio of general education students to special education students in the RISE preschool program. We take great pride in our RISE preschool program. It is a public school program, and our teachers are highly qualified. They have master's degrees, and they're dual certified in both general education and special education. And those are huge benefits to those students in that classroom. So here is a chart that breaks down some of the programmatic changes that have occurred since 2005, which has created this crunch of space at the elementary level. So the full-day kindergarten piece I've already talked about. We started with 5 in 2005-06, 1 for each of the elementary schools. Next year we are up to 12, which includes what is called 2 integrated kindergarten schools. And so let me take a second to talk a little bit about what an integrated program is. Because we're so tight for space and we have such now a high demand of full day and such a low demand for half day, there are some schools that we aren't able to have 1 classroom dedicated to half day. So what we've done in 2 schools this year, Wood End and Birch Meadow, is that we have created what's called an integrated kindergarten program, which includes half day and full day students in the same classroom. So what that means is that the half day students go until 11:30 with the full day students. At 11:30 they leave for the day. The full day students go to lunch. Next year we're going to be also doing this at Joshua Eaton because we have the same situation that we don't have enough space. We have a low half day number and a very high full day number. So it's one of the ways that we've had to deal with the fact that we don't have enough space for for the kindergarten program. We've also seen over the last several years an increase in the number of special education programs in the district. These are for students that have specific special education disabilities. When we first started in 2005-06, we had one classroom in the district at the elementary level, and that was the DLC program for students on the autism spectrum, and that was at Barrows. We are now up to 6 classrooms dedicated to programs in the district. And you can see here are the different types of programs, the DLC, the ILP, which is for students that are low cognitive, that's at Wood End. The SSP is for students with social and emotional issues, that's at Killam. And the LLD program for students with language learning disabilities, that's at Joshua Eaton. When you have these programs, there is huge benefit. One is these students are now staying in the Reading Public Schools with their peers, which is what we certainly want for that to happen. And then a secondary reason is that to send a student out of district instead of keeping them in district is a financial impact to your operating budget, both from a transportation perspective and to send them to a private school or a public collaborative. So certainly there is a cost savings, but also it's better for kids to have them with their like peers instead of going to a school outside of Reading. I also mentioned the Rise Preschool piece, that we've seen an increase there from 5 to 7, where 2 of those classrooms are now at Wood End. And where does this space come from? Well, a couple of things have happened. We are actually in a classroom deficit for space in our elementary schools. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But one of the places that we have lost classroom space is art and music. When the 5th elementary school came online in 2005 and 6, one of the commitments that was made at the time is that we would have separate art and music classrooms at each of the 5 elementary schools. That hasn't happened. Over the last couple of years, we've had to pull from those classrooms so that we could provide additional space for full-day kindergarten and the special education programs. So now we are in a situation where we have 1 classroom or sometimes 2 smaller classrooms in an elementary school. And people say, well, why can't we just have our art and music teachers go on a cart? You know, when I went to school, that was the way it was. Well, we made a curriculum change in 2005-06 so that music would be taught in a classroom, art would be taught in a classroom. And the reason why we did that is because we wanted to have quality art and music programs, which feed then into our middle schools, which have strong art and music programs, which then feed into our high school, which has very strong art and music programs. And it does start at the elementary level. It actually starts at the preschool level, where we offer music therapy classes, music movement classes. You can't teach music or art the right way on a cart. And it would be like trying to teach science on a cart, or social studies on a cart, or English on a cart. You require supplies, you require instruments, you require, we have in some of our schools a kiln that's part of our art room. So it's extremely important to have the educational space instead of trying to move that around. So what this is showing is right now in the Reading Public Schools, how are our classrooms being used? So when the buildings were originally designed, this is the line for that. This is total general classrooms, and you can see that each school is a little bit different based on the design of the school. Our 2 biggest schools are Eaton and Killam. And then we have our 3 smaller schools, Barrows being the smallest. But what this line shows is these are the number of classrooms that are being used right now. Now you can notice that there are more classrooms being used than what were originally designed for general classrooms. And part of that reason is we are using other educational space as classrooms. And the example I want to give, and this is common in all 5 schools, is I want to use Barrows. And right now, we are using 18 classrooms. One of the classrooms is a music classroom, which is a much smaller classroom than our regular size classroom. So if you can picture, a typical classroom is 900 to 1,000 square feet. The Barrows classroom is about, I believe it's about 700 square feet. So we're using that as a 3rd kindergarten classroom for the half-day program. This year, because of the number of students that wanted half-day, we had 26 students that want half-day this year at Barrows. We split it into two half-day sessions, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And so there were 13 students in that classroom space, and the space is fine for 13 students. Next year, we have 18 students that want half-day kindergarten at Barrows. So we can't create an integrated kindergarten setup like we did at some other schools because the third classroom space is too small. So what we have to do next year is we actually have to take that 18 and we have to cut it in half. So we have a morning session of 9 and an afternoon session of 9. So in order to do that too, we have to also hire a half a kindergarten teacher because that was a half that was not part of the original budget. So because of a space situation, we had to increase our operational budget by a half a teacher when we could have utilized that space if it was a normal size space to have one half-day session of 18 students, which is a perfectly acceptable class size for kindergarten if the space was the right amount. So that's an example of how the lack of classroom space has affected what we're trying to do at the kindergarten level. So the next slide shows you what would happen if we had the optimum space for the programs that we need for the enrollment and population that we have. So this line here shows you that these would be the total number of RISE or full-day kindergarten classrooms that we would need for the number of students if we would go full-day kindergarten for all students. And for RISE, it would be for our current RISE population, with maybe a little bit of an increase of enrollment. So you can see that in some schools, our two bigger schools, we sometimes have had 4 kindergarten classrooms that we would need. In our other schools, it's usually 3. In RISE, we could use up to 10 right now with the waiting list that we have. These are the existing classrooms that we have available that were originally dedicated for these programs. These are the additional ones that we would need, so when you add these two numbers up, it gets to this number. If you total these numbers up, for full-day kindergarten, it equals 17. That's an important number to remember for later, and for RISE, 10. In addition, I mentioned to you earlier that we were at a deficit of classroom space. Ideally, what we should be having, not ideally, actually we should be having, from a compliance standpoint, we should be having an additional 2 special education classrooms in each of our buildings. We should be having a K-2 learning center and a 3-5 learning center, and we should be having for each of the schools that have programs, a K-2 program classroom and a 3-5 program classroom. Right now, that's not the case. Usually we have 2, and they're consolidated, and in one school we actually have 1 classroom that houses both learning center and the program. We had our coordinated program review this spring, and one of the things that they cited us on is that there is a lack of classroom space in general for all of our special education programs in the district, not just at elementary, but at middle school and high school as well. Also, as I mentioned earlier, we are in a deficit of art and music classroom spaces in several of our schools. Birch Meadow is the only school right now that we have a separate art and music classroom. So if we had the optimum space, this is what we would need to maintain where we are and where we want to go. So this brings us to, if we were going to go to an early childhood center concept, how many classrooms would we need? So this is the 17 that I mentioned to you earlier. And that's by taking the number from each of those 5 schools that I showed you in the previous slide. This is based on a class size of 19, which is based on an enrollment of about 323 kindergarten students in the district. For preschool, as I mentioned to you earlier, that's 10 classrooms. Class size is 15. That is the class size number that we've been using for RISE across the board over the last several years. And then certainly we would need the other areas of music, library, gym, and special education. So that's where we came up with the number of classrooms needed for the early childhood center. So now I want to go through how did we get to this point. We talked about the needs, but we actually started having these conversations in January of 2011 when we realized that we didn't have an enrollment issue in our district, but we had a programmatic issue in our district. And more, as you saw in the charts earlier, that more and more families were starting to enroll in full-day kindergarten, and we were running out of space, and that we also had the increase in special education program needs. So in November of 2011, town meeting approved some funding to do a design study. I believe it was $40,000 to do, not a design study, I'm sorry, an elementary space study, which we contracted out Frank Locker and Associates to do. In June of 2012, we presented that study, or Frank Locker presented that study to the Board of Selectmen, the Finance Committee, and the School Committee in a 3-board meeting. And from that point forward, we started looking at different ways that we could accumulate space to address the growing needs that were outlined in the Locker report. And as part of that, the School Committee voted in October 2012 to support the implementation of full-day kindergarten once space became available, which was a really critical first step because the School Committee realized that we really needed to move forward with going with publicly funded full-day kindergarten for all students, but we also realized that we couldn't do it at that time because space was an issue in the district, and we really couldn't make that commitment until the space issue became resolved. So we also, during that time, we started looking, as I said, at options, and one of the options we looked at was the Woburn Street School next to St. Agnes, and the town and the schools were negotiating with the Archdiocese for several months, and in April of 2013, we reached a letter of intent with St. Agnes for that site. The reason why St. Agnes was strongly looked upon at that time, because we felt that from an educational and a financial point of view, that would be the best solution to address the full-day kindergarten, the preschool issues for the town. But what was happening as we moved forward, and we received some funding from the town at town meeting to start looking at the feasibility of that site, is we started realizing that we were running into, through the feasibility study process, we started realizing that there were significant parking and traffic issues, and that the cost, because it was a building that was over 50 years old and required renovation, a 3rd floor was going to have to be added within the building, that this was going to be more expensive than originally thought. So in August of 2013, at a financial forum, we announced that we were no longer pursuing Woburn Street as an option for those very reasons. We had several meetings with the community. We met with the abutters. We met with any other interested parties during the summer of 2013, and also after talking to the architect and getting an estimate cost of it, we came to that conclusion. So we decided to take a step back and hit the reset button and form a community working group in October of 2013 that would basically look at anything out there, keep an open mind, and vet out any options that could provide us the space necessary. And so that working group worked from October 2013 to March 2014 to identify options and make recommendations, and we did utilize the services of AI3 to help us in that process. So the working group consisted of 10 community members, a variety of different professions. We had architects, we had real estate agents, we had engineers, we had early childhood parents, we had citizens that were very interested in full-day kindergarten. We had school department members, but we also had elected officials, finance committee, school committee on there as well. And so this group worked for several months, and this is the working group who was part of it. And so the working group came up, with the help of AI3, came up with a matrix process to narrow down the options. And so the matrix that was used, the factors that were used in identifying which site and which option would be the best, included, first, obviously, education was one major factor, and these were all of the different pieces of that category of education. The parent piece, in terms of the improvements to the future learning environments, the convenience of it, is it going to improve the early childhood education piece? From a community standpoint, will it bring value to the community? One of the things that was discussed from the very beginning is providing an additional gym space, which is such a premium in this community, so that during off hours the community could access it. And making sure that the site itself was a workable site for traffic and parking and things like that. So the options that were considered, and there were probably, when it's all said and done, over 30 options that were considered. From renting space, to purchasing and renovating existing space, to adding on to each elementary school, to moving grade 5 up to the 2 middle schools, and which would then create K-4 schools, to building a new early childhood center, but looking at it different ways, either just kindergarten, just preschool and kindergarten, but also moving central office there to create even more space for the high school. So when we looked at building a full early childhood center, there were several sites that we looked at. We asked the town planner to give us a map of all available land, both private and publicly owned, so that we could look at those to see if it was adequate to hold a site that had a footprint with adequate parking and recreational space, playground space for students that would fit in early childhood center. We looked at parks. We looked at the water treatment, the old water treatment plant. We looked at 2 sites on Havel Street, which included near the ice hockey rink and then further north. We went back and looked at Woburn Street to see if we could actually purchase 2 homes on Prescott to try to have 2-way access to improve the traffic. We looked at the back of Coolidge, the back of Killam, property on IMLD's ownership, the 4 acres of land that are on Oakland Road, and also the Fine and Performing Arts parking lot side of the high school. We also considered splitting the early childhood center into 2 sites, having a north and a south, and one of the things that we realized, we would need to connect this to an existing school to share costs, operating costs, food service, things like that. So we looked at building it 2 out of the 3 of Coolidge, Parker, Killam. We realized that quickly this was not a good option because you would be essentially doubling, in a lot of ways, your operational cost by having 2 separate sites. So I know this is small, but I'm gonna outline some of the ones. This is the 12 that the working group actually narrowed it down to have serious discussion about with AI3. So this one is to build an early childhood center in the back of Coolidge and then relocate the soccer field, because that was something that was discussed is if you're gonna build it back at Coolidge, you've got to relocate the soccer field. So then we had to figure out where we were gonna put the soccer field. So we had that discussion. Building the early childhood center right at the Fine and Performing Arts site, building it at Killam, building 2 smaller ones at Coolidge, Parker, or Killam, building additions to Coolidge and Parker, which was the grade 5 option, creating a huge parking lot on the Oakland Road site to help offset with any of these other options that looked at either building at the high school or building a soccer field at the high school. Putting the early childhood center on the Oakland Road site, putting kindergarten only at the at the high school site, putting kindergarten, the early childhood center, no, putting only kindergarten and central office at the high school site, putting the whole early childhood center with preschool and central office at the high school site. Doing something a little bit different here, which was to build build the early childhood site at the high school, but build it on risers or higher, so that you could have the parking underneath the building, and then building a bridge to the high school. And then actually, we also looked at the Reading Public Library to see if you could build an early childhood center there. This was before the library was passed. So when it was all said and done, the working group recommended to the school committee 2 options. The first option, which is option 2, was to build an early childhood center for preschool and kindergarten at the Fine and Performing Arts site. And the second option, option 10, which was to include with that the central office. Those were the 2 options that were recommended. And the bottom line is that these were the 2 sites that could put the footprint of an early childhood center with adequate parking, with adequate traffic patterns, with the playground space necessary. All of the other places we looked, not only here, but in the previous slide, we ran into wetland issues. We ran into parking issues where the parking would have to be street parking instead of on the site itself. We were concerned with some of the RMLD sites, with the zoning issues, that it was in, of where it was located and how those would be possible sites for the adult zone or the medical marijuana area, and you don't want schools to be in that area. Also the location near the Wakefield line, because you want something that's more centrally located. And this is actually almost the center of Reading is in this area here. I believe it's Weston and Bancroft is the actual epicenter of Reading. And that will reduce also your busing costs if it's more centrally located. So really those were the factors that we looked at when we were coming up with these recommendations. And so those were moved on to the school committee, and the school committee, after much discussion and deliberation, went with option 2. And the reason why they went with option 2 is that to move the central office to that site, and it would cost $4 million more, really would not be a good economical use of additional space. So that's how they got to the option 2. So we certainly looked at other options as well, and I want to go over some of the ones that people have asked about during these sessions and other times that we've had conversations. And one of the big ones is why not build it at all 5 elementary schools? Why is it not feasible? And certainly if this was the option, this would be the most preferred option, I think, by everyone. So that you could have your full-day kindergarten at your 5 elementary schools, and those students would be there. Unfortunately, though, and we did have KBA, which was the owner's project manager for the Woburn Street feasibility study. We had them do a report. They took the Locker report, and then they did further study for us of our 5 elementary school sites. And unfortunately, we aren't able to build at our 5 elementary schools. In their current setup, we would have only 2 of them are rated as good candidates to build additions. And the other 3, it would be very difficult to build. So that would be one thing. Your construction costs would be extremely expensive. The $12 million is just construction, and that was a 2013 number, and that would be most likely higher as you go further. But it didn't include all the other costs that would be associated with it, with architect fees and moving costs and things like that, because one of the other things that would have to happen is you have to shut down wings of the building to make this happen. You also do not have temporary relocation space. You'd have to be essentially running several construction projects at the same time. And it would not address the preschool space issue. One of the things that our elementary schools are in very tight spaces, and they're in neighborhoods. And so this would be extremely difficult to do, if not impossible. The grade 5 option was also considered and discussed at length by the working group. Couple of things on this one. One is it would disrupt the current middle school structure and philosophy. Our middle school structure and philosophy works very well for a grade 6, 7, and 8 model. We actually have very successful middle schools in our district. And because that is such a delicate age to begin with, because they're going through adolescence, you want to make sure you have the right structure in place. When you add one more grade to that, it's going to disrupt that structure, and it would not necessarily have the same benefits that it has now. In addition to that, though, it doesn't address the preschool space needs. But more importantly is that your current core spaces could not handle an additional 200 or 150 students. Your cafeteria was not built for that, your gym wasn't built for that, your library, art, music. So you would have to either increase core space, or you'd have to come up with some sort of other scheduling setup, such as much earlier lunches, things like that, to address that. You also would have major parking and traffic flow issues at Parker, because you would be using their available space that's left to build an addition of probably 10 to 12 classrooms, an additional multi-purpose room, art, music room, things like that, to accommodate the additional 200 fifth grade students that would be coming there. And Parker already has parking issues to begin with, and traffic issues. So grade 5 option was quickly, after a lot of discussion, was dismissed because of those reasons. Another thing that came up in these conversations was the 6th elementary school. So again, your 6th elementary school would still have to be in the same site that we're proposing now, which would be the parking lot of the high school. That would create some major redistricting issues because of its proximity to Birch Meadow. So you essentially would be taking the existing 5 schools, you'd be redividing up the lines in the entire district to make 6 evenly divided schools. Your operational costs would actually be higher with a 6th elementary school than it would be a preschool kindergarten facility, because elementary schools require additional personnel that an early childhood center would not. So you would have some additional operating costs. You'd only have 2 teachers per grade, which would create huge fluctuations in class sizes in each grade. With 3 to 4, which we currently have in our 5 schools, it is easier when you're trying to balance class sizes. With 2, it would be impossible to do for a grade level. And preschool, we would not know if we'd be able to distribute through all 6 schools the preschool. So again, preschool would be part of the issue. Woburn Street we've already talked about, so I'm not going to go into more detail with that. So what does this all look like? And so some of you may have seen some of the conceptual drawings, and I do want to caution you that what we're talking about right now is strictly conceptual. We asked the architect to make some drawings of what this could look like. These are not schematics. That would be the next step in the process. Everything right now is based on conceptual facts, and also known costs to by industry standards. So this is what the space requirements would be. It would not necessarily look like this, but I mentioned to you earlier, you'd have your 17 kindergarten classrooms. They would be on the 2nd floor. You'd have your 10 preschool classrooms. They'd be on your 1st floor. Full-size gymnasium. It's about the same size as a Barrows or Wood End space. And again, that would be for community use as well as for early childhood center students. And if you're looking at the footprint, to give you some bearings here, this is the fine performing arts end of the high school. Here is the field house. I'm sorry, here's the field house. Here's the math science wing. This is currently where RISE is, right here. So one of the things that certainly we needed to figure out in the process is parking. Because if you're going to put a new building on a parking lot, you have to come up with where are you going to come up with 141 spaces that you used that were there for that site. So that was one thing. But in addition to that, you need to have additional parking based on the needs for the adults and for the parents that would be coming to that site. So we followed the formula for although we are not required to, we followed the formula for zoning in terms of what we needed for parking spaces, the architect. And so again, this is all conceptual, but what they would be proposing to add additional spaces is to extend the current east parking lot by 44 spaces at this end of the high school, to take what is now the Rise Preschool and make 17 more parking spaces here, to take this existing parking space here and expanding it for an additional 49 spaces, create 52 spaces around the building itself, and then the bulk of this would be to create on the Oakland Road site 103 spaces where the 4 acres of land is right now. The reason why, I should back up. The reason why we can't build a school on Oakland Road is because of the topography of that site. And there have not been geotech work specifically done there yet, but if you look at that site, there are two, at both ends is 2 hilly areas that possibly ledge, and then it goes to a steep, flatter area. And so the parking would be proposed to be put in this area here, which is more the flatter area for the additional parking. This number could probably go up with geotech testing. You know, most likely that 103 will go up. But again, right now, this is all very conceptual drawings. The one thing that, and we worked very closely with the police chief on this, the one thing that he made very clear, and certainly we abided to and respected, was that not to include Oakland Road parking as part of the number. So this does not include any of the Oakland Road sites. There's about 96 spaces on Oakland Road that right now are not included in this number. That would remain for overflow, drop-off, pickup, things like that, overflow for events. So we're very careful not to include the Oakland Road piece as part of this. So that's conceptually how the parking would look. In terms of the traffic, that is what a traffic study would look at. And I know there's been a lot of conversation about traffic and concerns that people have right now about traffic with existing conditions. But a traffic study is what would be looked at to look at the pattern that currently exists in and around the high school. Maybe that needs to be looked at differently. How traffic flow occurs in the morning and in the afternoon. Are there certain streets that need to have do not enter so that you don't have local traffic going through there? All of those things a traffic study would like. Do we put speed bumps throughout the complex, which is something that has not been done in the past, but I know it's been brought up as a concern. All of that would be coming as part of the design study, which is the next step. And would include lots of community meetings with the butters as part of that. Another option that was talked about is the modular classrooms, and for the same reasons that you couldn't add on, for the same reasons that you couldn't add modular classrooms, you don't have the footprint space to do it, and also with some schools that are not up to code for fire sprinkler protection, it would trigger additional things that would have to be done. Handicap accessibility, fire sprinkler protection, things like that, full fire sprinkler protection, things that would have to be done if we started adding modular classrooms. So in addition to the other pieces of building to those sites, you would have the same issues with modular classroom sites. And again, it would not address the preschool issue, and it would not be a permanent solution to the programmatic shifts that are going on. So one of the questions that's also come up is what will you do with the vacated space? And as I showed you on a slide earlier, the vacated space, we're at a space deficit right now. So your vacated space is going to be used for separate art and music classrooms, additional special education program and learning center space that we're really right now we're out of compliance on. There are, during certain years that we have what are called enrollment bubbles that come through, and you really should have an additional classroom or two at each elementary school to deal and address those enrollment bubbles when they come through, which we do not have. So That space could be used for unanticipated class size issues. But also it gives us the opportunity to use the space for other innovative programs that we haven't been able to do right now because we don't have the space. So for an example, we have some students that may not be ready yet for grade 1 in our district, and having an extended kindergarten program for them. Or sometimes to go from preschool to K, having an older kind of preschool kindergarten program. We don't have the space for those things right now, but those are things that we do have a need for students in this district. And that's what the additional space would go towards. So that space would be used up very quickly for needs that already exist. So there's a few other questions and topics that have come up that I'm going to have Mary actually address at this time. One being the MSBA funding piece.
Yeah, I'll talk about that, and I guess the busing costs, and I guess I should come close to the microphone.
Yep.
We've been in conversations ever since when we were having conversations about the Woburn Street School. We started a dialogue with the Massachusetts School Building Authority to determine whether or not we would potentially be able to get some funding under that program. We've heard through those conversations a number of things, and MSBA is not going to obviously come right out and say that they are or are not going to fund a program, but what they've said to us is a few things. They have told us that, first of all, they have yet to fund an early childhood center or preschool building. Their focus is on K-12 education, not the preschool piece. So they have yet to fund that. The other thing about the Massachusetts School Building Authority is that their funding and their allocation of funding is based on a priority scheme, and those priorities are typically that the building, a building in your community is deteriorating, that the physical infrastructure of the building is deteriorating, or that you have such a spectacular increase in enrollment that your school buildings are not large enough to deal with that enrollment increase. We don't have any of those issues. First of all, in the survey, MSBA goes around and they survey all of the school buildings in Massachusetts, and they assess them a ranking, 1 being the best condition and 5 being the worst condition. All the schools in Reading are ranked 1 and 2 in the best condition, and that's because we've done such a great job maintaining our schools, and we also have a lot of newer schools as well. So none of our buildings, or if we submitted a statement of interest to MSBA, the question would become, what is the problem that you're trying to solve? It's not that we have any buildings that are in deteriorating condition. It's not even that we have significant enrollment growth. This is a programmatic shift that a community like Reading, who is seen as being relatively affluent, obviously is following suit with the 242 other communities who feel that publicly funded full-day kindergarten is the way to go, and that providing as many opportunities as possible to parents who want to enroll in our preschool program. These are programmatic shifts, not enrollment growth. We don't have any projections of huge enrollment growth in Reading. There's fluctuations year to year, but there's no big growth because we are pretty much built out. So what we're hearing from MSBA is that the likelihood of funding for this project is pretty unlikely that we would receive funding for this type of a project. Even if we were to go through the MSBA project, what we would have to do is pick a school building, because they typically only look at one building per community, and say this building has this problem and define the problem. Again, our problem is not the condition of the building, it's not enrollment. So we would have to go through this entire statement of interest process. We would have to fund a feasibility study where they would look at that school, potentially other schools, and they would come up with the definition of the problem, and then they would kind of fund based on what they defined as the best solution to the problem, which, as I said, has not yet in Massachusetts been the construction of an early childhood center. So that's where we are with the MSBA. In terms of busing costs for the early childhood center, so for those of you who are not aware, the law in Massachusetts is that you have to bus any child K to 6 who lives outside of a 2-mile radius from the school. We're fortunate in that most of our schools are community schools, neighborhood schools, so that doesn't happen very often. The only schools where we actually have to transport kids are Killam, that's the only elementary school, and then there's a handful of 6th graders that attend Parker and Coolidge who are outside that 2-mile radius. So what we do to sort of maximize our efficiency and to maximize the potential revenue from transportation as well, is we run what's called 3 tiers. So what happens each morning is that 2 buses leave and they pick up high school students, and those high school students pay $365 a year to ride the bus. Those 2 buses then, once they drop off at the high school, go and pick up students from Coolidge and Parker. Again, 7th and 8th graders who are along the bus route, they can jump on the bus and they pay for that option, as well as 6th graders who are within the 2-mile radius, and only those that are outside the 2-mile radius pay. That's a very small number of children. Then, once they drop off at the 2 middle schools, they go and they pick up the students who attend Killam. And again, we have some paid riders who are within the 2 miles, but they're along the bus route and their parents elect to transport them. So what we would propose to do for this early childhood center is stagger the start times such that this would be the 4th tier. So once the buses left and dropped off the kids from Killam, they would then go pick up the kindergartners. We are not required to, nor do we transport preschoolers unless it's part of their, transportation is part of their IEP. So we would then, at the option of the parents, pick up the kindergarten students that are outside that 2-mile radius. And as John mentioned, this location is pretty center to the town. The town is only 9 square miles, and so there's probably people close to the North Reading line and close to the Stoneham line and Wakefield line that might be part of that transportation pickup. But by creating that 4th tier, we don't have to engage a whole nother bus. We're just adding a 4th tier, so we'd probably be paying to extend the time of the bus drivers and the fuel costs. So maybe we're talking about adding 25, worst case scenario, 25 to 50,000 as the range for the additional busing costs associated with the early childhood center.
So, kind of wrapping things up here. Some of the things that we do know, that we have heard from the community, is there is a strong support for the publicly funded full-day kindergarten piece. Heard that loud and clear. Parents want to have, all parents want to have their children have the same experience. One of the things that has come up is, what are going to be the additional operating costs? And I want to make sure that we capture this. I mean, I don't want to make any promises, and we certainly don't have all of the answers yet. But here's some things that we do know. One is that a lot of our staffing for this building already exists, both at the preschool level and at the kindergarten level. The additional staffing that you're talking about would be a custodian, school nurse, actually not even clerical support staff, because we have a secretary at the Rise that would shift over to this new facility. You would need some incremental increases to some specialists, which would include your OT, PT, speech, which is special education services and reading, but those would be incremental. The administrator, we have a position, the preschool director position, which would shift over to become the principal of that building. So again, you're not adding a position. You would certainly have utility costs, repair costs, maintenance costs. Those would be additional costs. Some additional transportation costs, as Mary mentioned. And the additional staffing that you would need to make everyone full-day staff. Where we have been increasing over time, that amount of staffing needed is going to be less and less because we have less and less half-day classrooms. So a lot of the staff already exists in the district. We would need some increase in staff, as I mentioned earlier. So what if we do nothing? Which is a question that's been asked as well. We certainly will not be able to offer the publicly funded full-day kindergarten to all students. We will continue with a tuition-based program with the amount of space that we have available, and we're pretty much reaching our max at this point. 72 to 75% is probably as high as that we can take for full-day kindergarten space for our district. We are going to continue to have other programmatic demands that we are going to be complied to address, and most likely special education space. So those are things we're going to have to eventually address either way. So one of the things that we've had to do over the last 2 years. The school committee, a couple of years ago, gave me the authority to assign new students to town or kindergarten students who didn't have siblings to outside their existing school district. And we've had to do that more and more. And so let me give you an example. When someone moves into Reading, we've told all the realtors that they need to list for the elementary school that they need to call central office, that they can't give them an elementary school. And the reason for that is that when they call us, we have to determine, based on class sizes, as long as they're within 2 miles, where is the most appropriate school for them to go to for the grade that they're in. So if they're coming in at grade 3 at Killam, and we look at the grade 3 class sizes at Killam, and they're pretty high, they're over the recommended number that we have for our school district, but Wood End's class sizes are lower for grade 3, and they live within 2 miles of Wood End, they're going to be going to Wood End. So we've had to do more and more of that. And with kindergarten, what we've had to do is we've had to move students based on cohorts. If they don't have siblings in that school, there are times when we move cohorts of students to another elementary school. And it's to do that because we're trying to, as much as possible, keep the class sizes balanced so we maximize the classroom space throughout our entire district. So we're going to have to do that more and more, and we do it right now about 25 to 30% of the time. If we don't have the classroom space, certainly what's going to happen is that more and more students will have to be in a classroom and your class sizes will go up. So a lot of the things I've talked about already on this list, these are the things that we've been doing to address the additional space issues, and I think I've talked about all of these. There are a lot of advantages to early childhood center, having an early childhood center, and there are, by the way, other school districts in the area that have early childhood centers. Wilmington is one, Tewksbury, Wakefield is actually going to it next year with full-day kindergarten. And you know, I should mention, because this came up the last time, in a lot of other communities, what has happened is, the reason why they've been able to go to full-day kindergarten is they have empty schools that they're either renting out or just not being used by anybody. In our community, the decision that was made when a school became empty many years ago, it was sold or converted to something else. So that's what happened with Pearl Street, that's what happened with Highland, and some other schools. So we don't have that empty school to be able to do full-day kindergarten with, like other schools. Wakefield next year is going to be doing that. They have a school which they've been renting out to a private school, which now they will take back, and they'll go to full-day kindergarten. But the advantages of an early childhood center, particularly near the location of the high school, is significant. You have greater collaboration between pre-K and kindergarten teachers. Right now, don't forget, you've got preschool in one location, you've got then kindergarten spread out over 5 schools. And so to have those 2 grades together will be huge for transition purposes of students and also for sharing of ideas. And that's something that they don't have that opportunity to do as much right now. You have an increased opportunity with high school students. We right now have high school students through our through some of our classes and programs go to the elementary schools and work with kids. You also have high school students work at Rise with those students. And this would just increase that opportunity because the school will now be on the campus for those students. And it's a huge benefit for that relationship. It's more effective use of resources, an economy of scale, to be able to share materials and staffing. You know, ideally, in a perfect world, you would have one K-12 school, where you could share all your resources together. Now, you know, we can't do that, but having an early childhood center where you're sharing resources throughout the whole district, you do have an economy of scale to that. And there will be, as a side benefit to this, reduced traffic and parking issues at our 5 elementary schools because of kindergarten no longer being there. So those are some advantages. Now, here are some of the areas of concern, and I want to make sure that we also, talk about these as well. These are the things that have been brought up. You know, traffic being one, the cost in the MSBA funding being another, the additional operating costs, the location, and the centralized kindergarten and preschool, having it in one location instead of at the 5 sites. And certainly those are all areas of concern. The traffic piece, as I mentioned to you earlier, a traffic study will help us solve both current issues that are occurring, but also future issues. And I think a result of this is we'll have a much better traffic solution than we do right now, because we don't have that resource that we've had it looked at. The funding piece Mary talked about. You know, certainly this is a decision the community will need to make about cost. And you know, our job is to put something forward that we feel is in the best interest of the students, and then the community would need to decide if this is something that they should have. The additional operating costs, as I mentioned, certainly we hope that we think that the Chapter 70 increase will offset the majority of these costs. The location, the working group did, believe me, if we had a piece of land in this community that was perfect with no traffic or parking issues, it would be ideal. That would be the site we'd go to. But the working group went through a lot of different configurations and options, and this is really truly the best site for an early childhood center. And in the centralized kindergarten and preschool, I know there was a lot of concern about this and transitions from K to 1. But actually, kindergarten students are very resilient, and they would make the easiest transition to a new school than, say, a 5th grade student going to middle school, or a 4th grade student, or something like that. And you know, again, there are a lot of benefits to having a centralized early childhood center that will certainly benefit students educationally, which I think is why you would make a decision like that. And so, why do we need to move forward with this? Provides a comprehensive full-day kindergarten program for all students. It provides the space necessary for our preschool program, and it creates the instructional space at our elementary and our high school levels so that we can continue to do the things we need to do there. And certainly it attracts families to Reading, and it maintains the strong property values for the community. I mean, education is one of the big selling points when someone is trying to sell a home, or when someone is trying to move into Reading. And certainly this will continue to strengthen those values. So the next steps. On March 31st, the school committee voted to have a school building committee that would oversee this project, starting with the design, if a design study is passed. So that is one piece that's in place already. On April 28th, which is Monday night, at 8:30, there's going to be a special town meeting for this amount, the $485,000 that would be funded through debt instead of out of free cash. The advantage of doing it that way is if down the road there is a debt exclusion override, that this amount can be rolled into that amount, whereas if it was coming out of free cash, it could not. So that is happening on April 28th. The Board of Selectmen voted a couple weeks ago to have this as a special town meeting agenda item. If it is fortunate enough to pass on the 28th, the school building committee would be formed, which is a cross-section of the community. The owner's project manager and the architect would be hired through using the school group building committee as the group to do that piece. And then the timeline would continue with a November town meeting presentation with the design being presented with a cost of the project, which potentially could include a debt exclusion override if town meeting approves it. Right now, the timeline would be for September 2017 opening. Here's what the $485,000 would fund. This is assuming that the project cost would be $26.2 million. The majority of it would be the schematic design by the architect, but you could see that there's certainly a cost for a notice project manager, which is required to have. And then all of the different investigations and surveys that I was talking to you about earlier, which makes up the rest of the $485,000 cost. And then an independent estimate by another third party for the owner's project manager piece. That's what the $485,000 funds. And that's all based on industry standards for the cost, where that came up with. So we have one more, if there are people that are interested to attend, there is one more this evening, right here at Coolidge, as well.